Every year, the first Sunday of Advent comes shouting through the door. I don't know if you've noticed it, but it does. Every year, the first Sunday of Advent comes shouting through the door to sort of jolt us out of our bucolic and comfortable food-induced Thanksgiving stupor. Wake up. I mean, it comes with its bold apocalyptic images, and it comes with its jolting declarations. Advent 1 refuses to let us sink too quickly into a cozy, quiet Christmas. It comes demanding that we see the signs of the times. It comes demanding that we see and know deeply in our minds and in our guts that the incarnation can never be separated from end times prophecy. We don't ever put those together, do we? They're all one thing. It's all one big tapestry of a thing that actually begins. What we want to celebrate at Christmas time in a few weeks is actually the beginning of the end. Because this is a story about Jesus. And so Advent 1 comes forcing us, demanding us, yelling through the door to say, wake up. Look at the signs of the times. Things are happening. The time is getting nearer when this story is going to come to its final chapter. And we don't know when. We know this. It's nearer than it was last year at this time. And it's coming. Every year on this particular Sunday, unlike the other Sundays, every year on this Sunday, the first Sunday of Advent, we get snippets from the little apocalypses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In year A, it's Matthew, of course, and we have readings from Matthew 24 and 25. In year B, we get those sections from Mark chapter 13. And here we are at the beginning of year C, and we get 3 paragraphs from Luke 21. Jesus, in that chapter, we didn't read the whole chapter, just those 3 paragraphs, verses 25 through 36. Jesus has already talked about in the previous paragraphs about signs of wars and insurrections and persecutions that will happen in the world before he comes. And now in our verses, we hear about the signs that are on the very cusp of his coming. He says there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and the earth will have distress. Among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves, people will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world. Given what's happening in our world, I mean, maybe I'm the only one here, but we live in a world that it seems that our planet is getting hotter. And hurricanes are intensifying, and tidal floods are increasing, and fires are spreading. Could it be that we are seeing signs in the sun and the moon and the stars? For many years, I read those apocalyptic passages, and the ecological pieces of them sort of didn't even faze me. They went over my head or under my gray matter or something. I don't know where they went. But they're ecological. And we're living in a world of apparent ecological topsy-turvy. I mean, from 12 years of age, I grew up in hurricane country. And I never experienced what they've experienced in the last few years. I mean, for us, hurricane days were like a snow day up here. we'd get our snowboards or not our snowboards, our surfboards and go out to the beach hoping for the big waves. That's what we'd do if we had a day off school. You wouldn't do that in these last couple of hurricanes. And there's not only the ecological stuff, there's the political things. And in our world of we've just gone through a polarizing federal election cycle and yet another year of war in the Ukraine. And we watch every day and listen to the news on our feed of the tinderbox explosive that is the Middle East right now, and the rising global political radicalism. Signs of the times? Do things seem to be growing more and more dismal? Perhaps. And so it's not surprising to hear the words of Jesus that when people see these kinds of signs and notice that these things are happening in the world, that people will faint from fear and foreboding of what is to come, of the judgment and consummation of all things, the time when the heavens will be shaken and Christ comes again. But the fascinating thing about this passage is that is precisely not the response of the disciples of Jesus. He says here instead that those who follow Jesus, when they see these signs of the times, the kinds of things that we've just thought about, says the disciples of Jesus rather are to stand up rather than faint. They're to raise their heads and look up, for the day of their redemption is drawing near. What a different response. Of course, it's in the very nature of this kind of literature, this apocalyptic literature as it's called, that there are things that remain mysterious. I mean, the language itself is the language of hyperbole and imagination rather than the language of logic and chronology or journalism. It's that kind of literature. And so we want to allow the poetry to be the poetry. We don't want to try to tame it. We want it to soak in over us and allow us to sense what it's trying to do in our spirit and in our imagination. And so when Jesus says those words, for example, that this generation will not pass away until you've seen all these things happen, did he mean, as those earliest Christians no doubt thought he meant, that they would see him come back, have gone and come back before they pass away, that generation? Well, it turns out he probably didn't mean that. But perhaps he was simply driving home the point with this kind of literature that this is the way the world lives. Every generation is going to see these kinds of signs. Some of you, maybe it's the older we get, we become more interested in our family history. You just go back in your parents' history or your grandparents' history or your great or great-great-grandparents' history, or as far back as you're able to go, and start reading the narratives of what was happening in their lives. And you know what? You're going to see wars and rumors of wars and ecological turmoil of different sorts, perhaps. But they were sensing and feeling the same kinds of things that we are sensing. Every generation will, and ours will not pass either until we see them. And Jesus' point is so very clear. The overarching point is unmistakably clear, that God's people, that Jesus' people, Jesus' followers, amid a world of uncertainty, amid a world of chaos, that God's people are not to be taken by surprise because they've learned to read the signs of the times. And that these things point somewhere. They're to be not taken by surprise, but filled with a sense of wonder and gratitude and anticipation. Could this be the day? There'll be some generation, might it be ours, that will be alive when Christ returns. But we don't know. The overarching point is for us not to be afraid, but instead to be ready. Advent 1 comes shouting through the door, not to engender fear, but to engender vigilance. It comes shouting through the door not to create a foreboding sense of frightening, but a sense of hope, because you know that this leads to something else. Not anxiety, but readiness, not resistance, but humble confidence. Or to put it in a phrase, is to teach us how to live in readiness for eternity and for the coming of Christ. It's to teach us how to live from the inside out, or to play on Jesus' words here, it's about the guarding of the heart. What does it mean to guard or to tend our heart? Jesus has these words here in verse 34, be on guard so that your hearts. He's driving inward. He's saying, see the stuff around you, but don't let those things happening around you be the focus of your attention. Guard your heart. And in these few verses, he gives sort of a mini primer on what it means to guard our hearts. The first thing I want to notice in Jesus is it's pretty obvious, but it's there in verse 34 where he says, be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down. There's stuff in our world that weighs us down. The first part of this primer is a recognition of reality. That we are called to recognize the reality of the world in which we live. And then the other phrase, first phrase is to weigh down. The other is at the end of another pair, which I'll talk about in a moment. The other is the worries of this life. There are plenty of things that can weigh us down. Do you know, every one of those gifts and all of the ones in the fellowship hall, I don't know how many persons, but 7 or 8 families, something like that. Every one of those persons has gone through something this year that is weighing down their lives. And it's the reality of our world. A primer in guarding our hearts includes this recognition that this is the way the world is, and we are not to pretend it doesn't exist or force it to go away by saying, well, everything is going to be all right, or to shove it under the carpet. But rather, we're to look at it face to face and name it as it is. It's difficult, it's evil, it's hardship. And there are people who need the care of others who have the capacity to care. Guarding our hearts causes us to recognize reality. And then that phrase, there's things that weigh us down. And we may not be the ones weighed down right now, but my guess is that every one of us is weighed down by something. Maybe not the same things or to the same degree, but there's something. Or there has been. or there will be. And then the other piece that he talks about being weighed down by are the worries of this life, the anxieties. Some of us are more prone to that than others. We're wired that way. But wherever we are on the proneness scale, there are things that weigh us down. Do you remember Jesus' sobering words when he gave the parable of the seed and the sower? He talked about some of the seed falls on thorny ground, and it's choked out by the cares and the riches and pleasures of the world. You know, the things that sometimes seem good, the riches and the pleasures turn out to be the weight. And it's part of the reality of life. It's a part of the kind of eyes and hearing and seeing that Jesus wants us to have if we're going to guard our heart. The second thing that I notice that Jesus talks about here is that there's an intentionality of practice. Not only is there a recognition of reality, but an intentional way of how we live our lives, an intentionality of practice. He uses two words, dissipation and drunkenness. I've always wanted to preach a good old temperance sermon. I won't, but I have my chance here. Be on guard, he says, against these things. He has two terms here that pair up, both terms which imply a lack of self-control and an excessive indulgence in the stuff of life. Easy to do, right? A lack of self-control and an excessive indulgence in probably what the kinds of things that John was talking about in 1 John when he talked about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Dissipation and drunkenness. The first of those terms, dissipation, is thought to be originally a medical term, to speak of nausea that comes from doing the wrong thing, or it comes from a sickness. The nauseating sickness of self-indulgence. To guard one's heart is to think about how you're living. It's intentionality of practice. And then to guard one's heart includes an anticipation of eternity. I'm struck with how Jesus talks here about the ordinary rhythms of life and how the ordinary rhythms of life ought to point toward eternity. He says, look at the fig tree and all the other trees. What do we know about trees is, one of my favorite times of year is the springtime when all of those different colors of green start happening. In the little buds that come out and then the leaves that come out. And Jesus says, the fig tree and all the trees are going to do that, and it points to something else coming. And in the very rhythms of ordinary life, he wants us to see a pointer to eternity. He wants us to see that there is one who is coming. And he wants us to see in the ordinary rhythms of life that there are transient things and there are things permanent. And friends, there's a lot more transient things than there are permanent things. The permanent things are few. The transient things are, everything else. Heaven and earth will pass away. All the stuff that we've been collecting. Indeed, everything will pass away except our relationships with God and one another. And he says it here in this way, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will endure forever, will never pass away. It's living in an anticipation. It's seeing in ordinary life, the ordinary rhythms of life, that there's pointers here that something's next. And then finally, this primer in the guarding of one's heart includes a posture of humility. So it goes back to where it started, and that is a recognition that things are heavy, that things are there that weigh us down, that trip us up, that cause us to fail, that cause us to fall. And if it were not for the strength of God in our lives, we would not be able to survive. And so he ends with these words, pray that you may have the strength to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. Guarding one's heart is to move through life with a posture of humility, because whether you think you're all that or not, you're not. And I am not. We aren't. As we step into this Advent season, the way of readiness for the coming of Christ at Christmas and for eternity is to guard our hearts. Because the human heart is the primary locus of the work of God in our lives. And when God begins to do that work of that God always unfailingly wishes to do, if we would only turn toward it, when we respond in receptivity and faith and surrender and gratitude, when that's happening, you don't have to fear the coming or the judgment or all of the multiplicity of other things that are happening that, frankly, are really scary in our world. And there's more. That when we do that and do it collectively as the body of Christ, we have this remarkable privilege of bearing witness in our world in the midst of chaos, in the midst of uncertainty, of the goodness and the grace of God. May God help us. Amen.